Welcome to ¿Qué pasa? HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness.
Saludos, HSI familia, and welcome back to ¿Qué pasa? HSIs. Today, we are diving into a new topic for our show, advising practices as servingness. Not to say it's a new topic per se, but an area we have not focused exclusively on in this podcast. Now, when I think about servingness, I think about the many dimensions of the campus infrastructure that must be redesigned to adapt to the changing needs of bilingual and bicultural Latine students. I can't stress enough that we must transform the curriculum and the student services in a way that is culturally relevant and responsive to the diverse identities of students at HSIs. Student services are interesting because we tend to think about these spaces as student-centered. But being student-centered is not enough in the servingness framework, as we must account for the students' social identities and lived realities. In other words, one size does not fit all. Advising practices, too, must account for the unique needs of the community and the community cultural wealth of Latine students. The research on advising practices in HSIs is limited. In 2020, when I published the edited book, Hispanic Serving Institutions in Practice, Defining Servingness at HSIs, there were 2 chapters that specifically addressed advising. Arnold Sanchez Ordaz and colegas at UC Santa Cruz wrote a chapter called Using Interactive Theater to Strengthen Holistic Advising at a Hispanic Serving Institution. I placed this chapter in the Structures for Serving section of the book because they provided a tangible way to think about changing the educational infrastructure for serving students. Specifically, they described the Multicultural Advising Conference, which was designed to support staff in providing equitable advising. It was a day-long conference that included a 3-hour interactive theater experience that showcased the experience of one student, Sergio, as he sought advice from multiple advisors on campus and the microaggressions that occurred. Guests were given opportunities to interact with the characters and engage in small group conversations about microaggressions in advising. The focus was on microaggressions because students on campus who participated in focus groups had reported experiencing microaggressions in advising. The goal was to move advisors to a framework of microaffirmations. This was one of my favorite chapters of the book as it provided an example of how HSIs can use Title V funding to provide innovative professional development opportunities for staff who interact with students every single day. The second chapter that focused on advising in the same book was written by Norma Jimenez Hernandez and was called Yes, You Are My Business, Examining the Effects of Intrusive Advising at a Hispanic Serving Community College. I loved this chapter too because I had written about intrusive advising in my book, Becoming Hispanic Serving Institutions. But Doctora Norma went a step further by providing statistical evidence that intrusive advising worked for students at an HSI. Specifically, she found that it had a significant effect on semester-to-semester persistence, with students in the treatment group who received intrusive advising more likely to enroll for the next semester sooner than those in the control group. There are other studies that have explored advising practices at HSIs, including those published by today's guest, Dr. Gabriel O. Bermea. Dr. Gabriel O. Bermea is a higher education leader with over 13 years of experience advancing student success at institutional and national levels. As a scholar practitioner, he specializes in academic advising, culturally responsive practices, and strategies for improving outcomes at MSIs, and particularly HSIs. Currently a visiting scholar at the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions, Gabriel researches academic advising practices that empower diverse students. He has published multiple impactful publications that are linked in the show notes, and they are open access. So I encourage you to read them. Gabe created the humanistic advising model, which focuses on holistic student growth and self-actualization. His expertise in culturally relevant advising has shaped training programs and advising frameworks at institutions. An active NACADA leader, Gabe serves as co-chair of the Scholarly Work Subcommittee and helped found the Latine and Hispanic academic advising community. His work emphasizes student centered strategies, equipping institutions to foster advising experiences where all students can thrive. So let's get into it. Gabe, welcome to Que Pasa HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. But first, we're going to talk about what brings you into HSI work. So go ahead and come on into the show and tell us about your Servingness journey.
Gracias. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you today. Wow. So it was, as an undergraduate, I attended what would become an HSI. And even in my graduate work, I remember like hearing about HSIs in my master's program, but it was never really the focus of our discussions, right? There wasn't really a lesson or a reading around it. They were just casually mentioned in a paragraph somewhere among the texts that we had. Specifically, the history of higher education text. I remember it coming up there. Even in my doctoral work, I started there, and or again, it was on the peripheral. It was there. It just wasn't the focus, right? The focus was really on organizational change and how higher education goes through those experiences, how to facilitate extra changes and the things like that. So that was really the focus. It wasn't until I got to my doctoral work, my dissertation work, that I was like, what do I want to study? And the topic I found was on presidents. It was a random thing. It didn't work out because shortly after that, I ended up moving from North Carolina back to Texas. And at that time, the thought was, I was going to go to a new institution, wonderful opportunity in the Valley. We were going to be back home with family. And so I left essentially ABD. Like I didn't finish the work, moved. And then eventually, like we had our son, and we moved here to Stephenville after working. But while we were in the Valley, though, I had told my wife, I said, I think I need to finish my degree. Like, if I don't finish my degree, Mikol's like, at this point, he was like not even one. And I was like, if I don't finish this, he gets older, life happens. I'm not going to be able to. I want to be there for the basketball. I want to be there for the Boy Scouts, whatever it may be that he chooses. I want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And so once he hits his life, I don't want to balance these two things. I need to knock it out. She goes, well, let's think about it. Let's talk about it. I kid you not, like within a week, the department chair from my university said, hey, Gabe, we noticed, a few years ago, are you interested in finishing? Because, we'd like to get you through. I said, if that's not a sign, then I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time I knew there were like we're like what, 1% of all doctorates, 3% of all doctorates. Men, I think, are 1% of
Mm-hmm.
all doctorates. So I was like motivated. I was like, yeah, I want to finish. So the first question was like, what's your dissertation going to be on? And I was like, well, I don't want to do the topic I did a year ago. But because I was in the Valley and because I was the director advising the Valley, I want to do something convenient, quite honestly, right? And so I said, I want to study student success and I want to study advising. I'll do it if I can. I'd like to get it done here and approved. And I ended up focusing on professional identity development among Latinx advisors, right?
Mm.
In that process, she was like, let me help you find your chair and figure your committee out. So I'm thinking she's going to find somebody who is in the world of advising. That was my immediate thought, you know. She comes back and she says, oh, I have somebody perfect for you. I think you're going to love them. Excellent expert, see if it fits. So she sends me the name Dr. David Ortiz out of
Mm-hmm.
Haku. And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, it didn't hit me. I was like, but he's not in advising. That was the first thing that crossed my mind. I was like, what? She was like, meet with him, chat with him, and again, it just didn't go through. And so I met with him. I Googled him. Obviously, that was the first thing I did, right? And then suddenly his bio from Haku and everything. And I was like, oh my gosh, she like gave me like HSI God, for lack of a better
Mm-hmm.
description, right? This is the
Mm-hmm.
person who would know, right? And then it slowly, we had a conversation. I met David virtually and we clicked. And he was like, here is why the HSI component is important. And he walked me through. And I was like, and it just, again, it hit me. And one of the first questions he asked was, you need to ask yourself, how has your brownness informed your research?
Mm-hmm.
That right there was the beginning. That question. And I was like, okay. He goes, I want you to start from scratch. We're going to build up, right? We're going to go from the ground. He took me down and he built me right back up, right? And that's how my journey to HSI started. Like it hadn't been on the radar, but he brought me in and he just told me everything HSI. And then that's began to just roll, right? Your book came in with that, right? All these other components that were soon came after were part of that journey. So yeah, that's how it, I would say, happenstance, right? It came into my world and I've been invested since, right? And the student success stuff, right, has really been
Hmm.
at the focus of my work. And when I
Hmm.
think about that, I think about two things: advising and faculty development. And so the
Yeah.
advising component has really been where my focus is, and I've enjoyed it so far. So yeah, that's how I've gotten into servingness and HSI world, if you will.
Yeah. Wow. That's an interesting way to get into HSI.
Yeah,
That's a fascinating
it,
story because yeah, I would never think to send a doc student to David Ortiz. He's an amazing person, knows a lot of stuff, but that's not where I would go. So yeah, that's really
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. It was. He worked with the program. He knew the program, so he had taught, I guess, in the
Ah,
program. He had done. I don't know. He had a connection. She had a connection with him, and he had done some work. It's just I didn't. Again, I was thinking advising, but he
yeah.
came in and he just framed it in a different way for me, and I was like, yeah, I don't know why it never, again, I don't know, stubborn, dedical, I don't know. The whitening of my education, who knows? But like it just didn't click for me until we had that conversation. And I thought, yeah, this is it. We're doing this. Let's go. So yeah,
Yeah, for sure. Did you go to undergrad in Texas?
I did. I did my undergrad at Texas Tech University. Yeah.
Oh, okay, Texas Tech. Okay,
Yes.
so oh, they're
Mhm.
they're a new HSI, so they probably
They're a
wanted
new
HSI.
HSI. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I
when you
was
were there.
very much in the PWI world of it all. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. They're
Yeah.
very, very new. So they're
Yeah.
still in the early stages
They're learning. Yeah. They're learning.
of trying to figure this out. Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
Interesting. Yeah. Because in Texas, you could have been at a campus that's been an HSI obviously for like
Yeah.
20 years, and then campuses that are not. So
Nope, not
awesome.
this one. But yeah,
Yeah.
they are new. I
No.
think what maybe like 4 or 5 years this. They're baby HSIs right now. So yeah.
Yeah, they're babies. I think 2019. So yeah,
Yeah.
pretty new. So okay. Awesome. Well, that was a fascinating story. Thank you for sharing that. So let's talk about advising then. It's your passion. If anybody Googles you and goes on your website, like it's like me and HSIs. Like there's nothing else. It's just HSI, right? Like HSI all day. It's yours is advising, right? Like
Mhm.
your advising is strong thread throughout all of your work. So let's talk about it. You
Yeah.
created a humanistic advising model. Tell me about it.
Again, a byproduct of my dissertation. So like
Mhm.
I had originally like studied, like I said, Latinx professional identity development among Latinx advisors. And as I'm going through, you never know what you're going to get, right? As you're going through these
Mhm.
studies. And a byproduct of the study was this notion of humanistic advising. I'd hear advisors talk a lot about how, they were asking a lot of questions from their students about understanding their motivations for college and, what their families thought about their journey here and, how their family was supporting them along the way. So there was already lots of components regarding, familia as a value in the advising conversations that are not always at the forefront of advising conversations, traditionally speaking. So in this context, in this HSI context, it was a very real conversation to say, how are you navigating balancing school with your family responsibilities, right? And how are you working at the same time and going to school full time? Like reality based conversations that were culturally relevant for the student. And advisors would say this relationship between us as advisor and advisee can be whatever it is you want it to be, right? And that was real eye opening for me because typically you have the advisor advisee relationship. There's this power dynamic that exists. And it's traditionally how it's, I would say, mostly like framed. You have the behaviorist approach where it's, the advisors are going to tell you what to do, right? You
Mhm.
have the cognitive approach where, again, it's I'm asking you questions and you're answering them. That dynamic, again, is still in play. And while over the last, like I would say, decade or so, maybe more, the constructivist approach of we're partners in this, advisee, we're going to co-create, we're going to co-design, co-develop your work, your academic plan, your program of study, is really sort of what's been taken off. What I was hearing was, well, what are your motivations? What do you need this to be? And the advisor was putting the student up here, and the advisor was here.
Mm,
That was empowering the student in a different way, right? And
mm,
that for me was the shift to say this relationship can be what you want it to be. I'm here for you, and by extension, your family. So, what do you need me to be for you and your family, right? Say on occasion, it's really not at the undergraduate level, right? That level of, shifting and saying, I trust you to make your decisions based on what your cultural context is, based off of yourself. You are expert in self. You are expert in the cultural context in which you operate. I respect that, right? So let me help you, support you, facilitate, coach you, whatever that needs to be in this moment. As a freshman, maybe a little bit different than it's going to look like when you're a fourth year, right? Or graduate senior, right? Those conversations, this relationship will evolve over the next 4 years, right? And that really caught. So I started diving through the data, and then humanistic advising came out as a result of that. From that, we have essentially 5 principles that came from those conversations. One is the humanistic advisor acknowledges that they're more than their education. So I think it can be very easy to think of a
Yes.
student's academic profile and say, oh, their GPA is this, right? There's lots of data you can have about a student. In Texas, we have TSI, which is developmental education. That TSI label can frame your perception of a student. So that academic profiling comes as part of that, right? And it's like you got to look past that profile, right? They are people. They are more than what you're seeing on the transcript, right? Two, with that in mind, it also recognizes that advisees are unique with their own identities, with their own emotions, and their own cultural backgrounds, all their own. And that's to be recognized, honored, and respected, right? And that's not always, again, at the forefront because not by, I don't think it's in, you don't want to say it's, maybe it is conscious. That's a whole other conversation. The psychology of advising is a space to explore, but you're just trained to say, here's the courses, here's the program study, let's talk about your goals, relation to the academics, right? But to talk to a person, right? You're having conversations right now about where they are in their academics. I want you to start with who they are as they to get to the where they are conversations, right? Which then gets to that third point of humanistic advisors are aware that they are that the student, the advisee, is the expert in self and the cultural context in which they operate. Talked a little bit about that already, but that's the third principle, the third belief. The fourth one being they're capable of making their own decisions and their own choices and accepting the responsibility for those decisions. You have to trust them to make good choices, right? You can't always tell them what to do, right? And then fifth is saying, how do I say it? It's easier for them sometimes with that academic profiling, there's a perception of what a student is capable of doing, right? The cultural wealth isn't always at the forefront of the conversation because you've looked at the transcript, you made some subconscious or unconscious, biases or decisions or choices about how you view a student. And the fact is, they apply, right? They were motivated to say, I'm going to apply. I'm going to go to college, right? There's cultural wealth that came with that, right? To make that journey happen. So they are there to learn, right? They may not they may not have made sense of the institution completely yet because it's like any new environment, you got to figure it out. But they're there to have meaningful learning experiences just like everybody else, right? And that's an asset, right? Even if that student is in developmental education, they made the choice to go. So therefore, you should put that same effort to making sure that they get across that completion line when all is said and done, right? They're there not only for the benefit of themselves, but their motivations are often tied to those of their community, their family, right? And their immediate community, because they're paving the way. They're pioneers, right? Those are the principles that shifted for me, the conversations that we don't always see in traditional advising models or frameworks or styles, right? These are things that are implied or inferred, but never fully directly expressed. And I was like, no, we're not. We're going to shift it a little bit, right? We're going to switch the paradigm. A student can be in the seat of their own education and own it, right? Without us constantly telling them what they should or shouldn't be doing, right? We can trust our students. And I think that's the hardest part is trusting, having empathy and care, right? And that's what this framework is all about. When we talk about humanistic advising, we're talking about meeting students as they are, and that requires care, trust, and respect, right? And empathy. Yeah,
Oh, I
that's me.
love it. Yes, it's giving servingness to me. I'm like, oh, like, and I say that because I think of advising as being a dimension of servingness, right? Like it's one dimension, one little piece of like this bigger structural sort of thing
Mhm,
that's going on.
mhm.
But everything you just said is like the same sort of core values
Yeah,
in the servingness framework, right?
yeah,
Like it is
yeah,
humanistic at its core, right? Servingness
yeah,
definitely is humanistic at its core. And I love that it's like taking the students' identities and experiences into consideration, but also the advisors,
yeah,
right? That like
yeah,
everybody's comes into it. And I feel like even when you're talking about like, oh, I don't do that in Servingness, like
yeah,
intentionally, right? I mean, besides saying educators should be match the students' identities, right? Like the
yeah.
compositional diversity, which is a huge conversation in HSIs,
Right, right.
particularly for faculty, but not as you said it, right? Like really being really thoughtful about identities come into the work.
Yeah,
So yeah.
definitely. I think that's one of the pillars too, is we talk about one of the strategies I tell advisors who are adopting this framework is self-disclosure is good, right? No one's saying to
Yeah.
reveal your entire life, but
Yeah.
part of that first phase is in the framework is, foster, and that's fostering the relationship, right? You're building
Uh-huh.
that, and that fostering is happening constantly, right? So
Right.
self-disclosure, get to know them. You bring your identities to the to the conversation as well. It's not a one-sided thing, right? And I'm so glad you said that, right? Because it speaks to that, is it's a we
Mhm.
thing. It's literally centered on the student, right? But
Mhm.
it doesn't remove you from the conversation, right?
Mm-mm.
You also bring a value add to the discussion, right? And that shifts the tone. The medium through which change occurs is the relationship as a result of that. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, and it very much reflects like, culturally relevant teaching practices, right? Like
Mhm.
the same thing, like relationship is key, disclosing who you are as an instructor, all those sort of things, right? It's like we are humans too,
Yeah.
right? Like we're not just like robots standing up there teaching or that the student comes to get advising from. We're not chatbots, right? Like that's a whole nother conversation, right? About whether or not advising will move that way. I hope not, right? That the
Yeah.
humanistic piece is actually core, right?
Yeah.
So I love it. Okay. Now you're
Thank-
getting me thinking about the way different frameworks can interact with the servingness framework.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, because I always love a challenge on the servingness framework. So I'm gonna keep thinking about it because yeah, it's interacting in a different way, I think, for
Yeah.
me. So
I
okay, so
love that.
let's keep. Yeah, no, we might have to publish a piece on that. So we'll talk
Hey,
about
I'm
that
ready
later.
when you are. Let's
All
go.
right. Yes. I see because you're like prolific right now. You're publishing a lot, producing a lot in your role at the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions. And I know you recently published at least two briefs, although we were talking before we started recording, and you said another one's coming too. So I know you're publishing a lot about advising practices, not only at
Mhm.
HSIs, but MSIs broadly, right? Bringing in other
Yeah.
MSI contexts as well, which is important. I know I was reading one, it was like dual designation, which is an episode this season about all the different dual designations and how we need to start thinking about that this is
Yeah.
getting really complex and we need to acknowledge that. So I loved seeing that also in yours. So yeah, and thinking about some of the things you're publishing, what unique advising models are you discovering at HSIs and what consejos do you have for HSI practitioners listening?
Ooh, that's a great question. So start with some of the unique models and practices that we're seeing here are I'll start with specifically with HSIs, because I think with HSIs what we're seeing is advising is elevated not just as a practice but a strategy at HSIs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes it's really easy to think about advising as it can sometimes be perceived as just a task, right? It's just something we do, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think for faculty, it can feel at times as a task, right? Because among the many responsibilities, it's under that sometimes that service category, right? I would argue it would need to be in teaching, but hey, service is typically where it's identified, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and with that, it's you see some of the HSI seeing, oh, advising can be much more, right? And you're starting to see some of it evolve into strategic plans, right? You're seeing it echoed there, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing it echoed to your frameworks of indicators of servingness conversations, right? Advising is in that
Mm-hmm.
realm, right? But I still
Yes.
think it's framed, even though it's a strategic plan, I'm still seeing it framed, I think, as, and I say this anecdotally because I want to do a study on this, but I think it's more framed still as a practice, right? But
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
acknowledge it as a strategy, though, to get to certain outcomes, right?
Right.
And so I think what we see at HSIs is, yes, it helps with the outcomes of persistence and completion and retention, right? And they also acknowledge that it does this core function too, which is registering students for courses, right? Getting them enrolled. The bread and butter is there. That's been proved, I think, time and time again. Right? You mentioned it about chapter 2 or chapter 16. I forgot which one it was in your book about, proactive advising having empirical
Hmm.
evidence, right?
Hmm.
But with that too, they're also HSIs are also seeing advising as an effort to and a strategy to get to belongingness, sense of belonging, creating those familial
Hmm.
environments, and a function of student learning, growth, and development.
Mm.
Right. So they're
Mm.
going beyond the HSIs are thinking beyond the
That part.
traditional, right? They're going
Hmm.
beyond the component of, oh, we're just registering courses, right? And we're just
Yeah.
worried about success in the complete set. No, they're thinking about the construct of the journey, right? And
Hmm.
so how advisors connect, right, becomes a different function, right? And I offer that as a distinction of that family environment component because I think there's familiar environments versus the in loco parentis that we often hear in higher education,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And for me, the distinctions are a little different because I had and I don't know who it was because it's a blind review, but in one of the articles that I wrote, they were like, well, this is the same thing as in local parentis, the family environments.
No
And I
way.
was, that's an interesting comment. Like, I was like, maybe I didn't articulate it correctly. Like, it may give some really reflective thought. My immediate thought was what you just did. You're like, no, it's not,
No
but
way.
I
Mm-mm.
call that out now separately because I don't want there to be confusion, right? So when I
Hmm.
think about familiar environments and advising the work, they're offering that care, that mutual support. They recognize that this is kind of mimic a bit of a family relationship, right? They're recognizing also that family is a part of these conversations, right? There's that level of community and trust, right? They're engaging with students beyond the academics. They're recognizing the person in front of them has an entire support structure beyond this campus. One hopes, right? And that this is going to be about the relationship. Whereas for me, in local parentis is more about the discipline, right? The student
Yes.
rights and responsibility, the
Yes.
dean of students, right? That for me is
Yes.
where that resides. And that's awesome. Kudos to them. But it's not the same thing as creating a familiar learning environment like advising is creating, right?
Right. Hmm.
That for me is a unique distinction that I think HSIs are cultivating, sometimes intentionally, sometimes
Hmm.
just because of the advisor in front, right, of that student.
Hmm.
You know? And then with that, that cultivates that sense of belonging through those conversations, right? And you can have those real meaningful learning and growth conversations with students along the way, which I think HSIs are recognizing that advising again is a strategy, not just a practice, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I'm thinking the
No,
other
I'm
thing.
still sitting with that local parental stuff. I'm like, and then I'm thinking
Yeah,
about how reviewer two always be pushing us because like you'd be like,
yeah,
no way. And then you're like, all right, fine, I'm gonna double down on like this is
yeah,
not it, right? Like
yeah.
I'm like, no way.
I
But
was
yeah,
like, I read it and I was like, what? you know,
hell no.
I'm glad you and I had the conversation because in my next one of my upcoming briefs, that's going to be I'm gonna make that very very clear. Like, hey, there's
Yeah.
a distinction of value here, and either you only read part of what I wrote, or maybe if I didn't communicate it effectively, I will own that. But yeah, it was something that stood out for me. I would say the other thing we're seeing about HSIs is they have different approaches to it. So in the advising world, there's, in the behaviorist tradition, proactive advising, intrusive advising, prescriptive advising, very transactional components, right?
Hmm.
Those are often functions of high caseloads, right? We just got to advise and go. And
Yes.
then you have the cognitive, like the Socratic method, right, where we're going to ask you question after question after question. Then you have things like the constructivist method, where it's developmental
Mm.
advising or appreciative advising, and then humanistic advising, motivational interviewing, that kind of stuff in the humanistic tradition. Right, so there's a lot of humanistic undertones in their work.
Hmm.
Right, I
Hmm.
think there is, and this is where I'd like to do more because I don't think they could articulate it that way because of another thing that came out from the studies is the conceptual components, which I'll get to in a second. But I think what we're seeing is there's a lot of humanistic undertones in the work, but HSIs tend to dip into four different buckets or approaches to advising. That prescriptive, and proactive advising / intrusive advising tend to be like the bread and butter, right?
Mhm.
Again, high caseloads means we got to get through students faster, so it's very transactional. But for those with the luxury of having caseloads that are balanced, or where they can have a more in-depth conversation with students, they're dipping into those those developmental experiences, those constructivists. They're having appreciative advising, and they're having developmental advising as 4 buckets in which they're diving into, dependent upon where that student is. Right, they're meeting them as they are in that sense. So it's recognizing that not one approach works for everybody. They're working with what they've got, right, as they are adapting to the student that's in front of them, right?
Mhm.
So that's exciting to see, but all of them had humanistic undertones. We're here to meet the need of this,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
We're here to meet them as they are, which is an interesting component to me, because I think that's something that they need to tell the story more, right? They need to elevate the work of the advisors at a higher level, right? To share that knowledge, to share those experiences, to speak more to an indicator of servingness, right? A little bit more.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I say the last thing is we're seeing that HSIs there's a disconnect between their training and their competencies, right? And one of the competencies that's missing is the conceptual, right? So I think they do, to borrow a word from Excellencia, that intentionality is there with advising, but they haven't thought about it as serving this, right? The conceptual
Right.
nature of it, right?
Right.
So, you know, this will be one of the questions I ask at the end when you ask me, but for me, it's like, hey, what is your philosophy of advising? Right, let's
Yeah.
talk about what that looks like. Right, I know you can have what does that what do you want that experience to be? What are the outcomes? Right, what's the nature of this relationship you're developing with your students, and how does it
Mhm.
complement the educational experiences that are created with their support across
Mhm.
campus? Right, that
Mhm.
conceptual component is missing big time. Right.
Mhm.
I do a lot of work with institutions to help them develop their advising philosophy. HSIs who are looking to say, hey,
Right.
we want to fill in some of this gap. We've done a lot of the from task to job, from job to a career, from a to a full-time job to a career ladder. Like they're building it, but what appears to be the bottom up, right? But now they got to work their way to that conceptual, right? To say, okay, we got some practices in mind. This is how we want advising to be practiced, if they're there. Again, that intentionality, but the servingness is still a spot that aspirational, right? How do you
Mhm.
see it for yourselves, right? How are we designing meaningful advising experiences for both the advisor, I say for all three, the advisor, the student, and the institution, right?
Right.
With their HSI identity in mind. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I have so many research ideas for you.
Yeah.
I'm constructing all kind of studies in my head. I'm like, oh, I wonder if you've done this. I wonder if you've done that. Like one thing I'm thinking about when I first read some of the work, that you were doing, I was like, so are these just practices that were happening at the institution, regardless of whether or not they were an HSI? So
Yeah.
that I'm definitely wondering about. But then also, as you were talking too, I was like thinking that Title V and Title III grants often
Mhm.
have advising components that are
Yeah.
built into the grant, right? That are
Mhm.
they're
Mhm.
funding advising
Yeah.
practices. It's one of those more common things, right? Like
Yeah.
advising, tutoring, those kind of things happen in a lot of HSI grants. So
Yeah.
like how many HSI grants have actually driven some of this work? But I don't know if you've done any of that. And if not, then it's a study for you. I'm giving you some research studies.
I
Come
may or
back
may
to
not
me.
have I may or may not have all those Title V summaries on my hard drive somewhere. So I will
Yes.
say, like, anecdotally, it's like, yes, it is in those fundings. You have to look for it, right? It's in those grants. But
Hmm. Hmm.
my hypothesis is that over a decade of those, it's increased. The request
Yeah.
for advising to build advising capacity has increased over the decade. So that's my hypothesis. I still need to go through and read all those. I got to get this one published first, right? But
Yes.
the goal is to go and read all of those, because I have them on my drive. I just got to do it, right? But yeah, because I want to see where those efforts are going. Where's that
Hmm.
money, right? And
Yeah.
my guess is based off of conversations I've had with institutions, not in a study format, but just in conversations, is it's going to capacity building infrastructure, and it's also going towards targeted populations. That tends to be the
Yeah.
big two. And
Yeah.
then on occasion, rare, it's there, but advisor training, right? Which is
Yes.
a whole
Yes.
other thing unto itself. So yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes, for sure, which we're gonna get to into a second, but I do wanna say I'm glad you've downloaded those already because
yeah.
we may or may not see the Department of Ed just
I know.
disappear, you know,
Yeah,
like and so those things, anybody listening, download HSI abstracts,
download.
download any data that is
Yeah,
available right now, you better download now because
yeah,
FOIA, get your FOIAs in. I don't know that they're gonna fulfill them, but
yeah.
yeah, like, yeah, that
If
I'm
it's
glad
there,
you have
download
those
it.
already. Download it
Yeah,
now because we don't do not know those that whole department might just implode and we'll be like, okay, there it goes. And a
mhm,
lot we use those as data, right? We
yeah,
use those abstracts as
yeah,
data. A lot of us do. So I'm glad you have that. But yeah, that's a fascinating question. I
yeah,
can't wait to see what you find in that because
yeah,
that I agree. I think it's often written into these HSI grants.
yeah,
You would see that more likely than like let's say something else I write about, which is like liberatory outcomes, right? We haven't seen that grow in HSI
yeah,
grants
yeah,
necessarily, but yeah, the practices or strategies, as you're saying, like advising, I think has become much more common in those
yeah,
grants. So okay, so yeah, moving into the competencies then and the training. You
right,
have been writing a lot about that, which I love because I definitely talk about we need to be HSI minded. This is one of my newer concepts, thinking about how do we become HSI minded, and training is one of them, one of the ways. So I love that you're looking at competencies and training because I want HSIs to be training their advisors, right? I even gave the example, right, of UC Santa Cruz, like how powerful that example was to think about changing the mindsets of your
yeah,
advisors. So tell us about that and some of the suggestions you have for training and development for academic advisors at HSIs and or MSIs broadly.
yeah. I mean, I think all institutions could benefit from some of these components. So when doing the study with MSIs in particular, there were 30 something MSIs in the study. Forgive me, it's been a while. But there were some MSIs in the study, obviously. And one of the things we inquired about were, what are some of the competencies that you think are essential for academic advisors in this day and age, right? I always think context, societal context is important. At the time we had, the George Floyd content happening on social media and in the news. There was lots of conversations around DEI nationally. We were in the whole Amazon being, right, fragility being on the top list. We were in this cultural context. So asking
Mhm.
that question in this context, I think was informed by that. But I think it also still holds true very much today, given our context now. So when asked, they all validated the three Nakata competencies which exist, which are informational, conceptual, and relational. Nakata did those about, I would say, almost 10 years ago now. They laid
Mhm.
those out for the profession to say, hey, these are competencies that institutions should work towards, making sure that advisors can develop when practicing. That those brought to the conversations for their own institutions. They said we have more that we think are essential, and one of those was intercultural communication. So it wasn't just communication; it was intercultural communication, right?
Mm.
Which is the distinction to be made, right? They valued the concepts of cultural humility. They valued the concept of being multilingual, bilingual, multilingual, right?
Mhm.
They valued those elements in the communication process, right? Of recognizing that communication can be both formal and informal when engaging with students, right? Each presenting a learning opportunity in and of itself, right? So intercultural communication, anti-racism came up as a competency that was asked. They asked for cultural competencies as a factor as well. They asked for technological competency, and they also identified personal competencies, that level of
Mm.
self-reflection, that professional development, the desire to grow, right, as an advisor in their field. Those they said we explicitly call out because we know
Mhm.
who our students are, we know our population, and so these are important to them, ergo they are important to us, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
That for me was really powerful. So when I then asked and said, well, if these are the competencies you value, how frequently do you train your advisors in these spaces? And that's where it got a little misaligned, right?
Mhm.
Informational by far, right? You got to know the catalog essentially to advise effectively. The programs of study, all that information was number one. That's the first thing. That I said, information and technological. You got to know how to use Banner or whatever your SIS is.
Mhm.
You got to know how to use the notes, all that stuff. The technology and the informational were essential and frequently, if not often, trained, right? That's
Mhm.
the highest that came back. But anti racism was rare. in the conversation,
Mm.
right? And as you think about liberatory, your outcomes that you mentioned earlier, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's a space, right? Because you can talk about advising, and I have a chapter in a book about HSIs that just came out in uh, January with like HSIs and student success or some. I'm assuming,
Intersectionality, something about
yes,
intersectionality. Yeah.
yeah,
I
intersectionality,
know
yeah,
the book, but I couldn't
yeah,
access the chapter.
yeah.
So,
I was like, Jared's been killing me for not saying it, and same
yeah.
thing with, nonetheless, though, I talk about creating trainings for social justice for advisors, right? Advising as
Mm-hmm.
social justice, right? There. So when you say you value anti-racism as an essential or extremely essential competency, and you don't have training on it, right? What assumptions are you
Mm-hmm.
making about your advisors when you hire them, or how important is it really, right? So there needs
Yeah.
to be a level of training. And then the second thing that is rarely trained on is the conceptual, which we talked about earlier, right? They don't
Yes.
talk about an advisor developing a philosophy of advising or understanding how the HSI identity of an institution informs their advising, right? Offers
Right.
that context, right? Those are much needed spaces for advisors to go beyond the practice, right? To
Mm-hmm.
elevate their work and their profession. I say that's the other thing. It's got to be a profession. They got to elevate the profession of advising. And part of that is the conceptual component. There's got to be a conversation at HSIs regarding the conceptual development of advising at their institutions. And students and advisors have got to be leading that charge all the way through, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so yeah, I think that's really what's come about is that we're seeing that. My report that's coming out, I hope in a month or so, is exploring more in depth about those competencies and then how the methods of training that HSIs are deploying to develop those competencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are they doing, classroom instruction? Are they doing, a computer, right? Are they doing shadowing? Are they doing observations? What methods of training are in place to cultivate those competencies, right? And then the other component that comes with that report is the professional development opportunities. What are you presenting, and where are those focuses, right? A lot of it right now, obvious, is networking and community building, which are the organizations, right? Professional learning communities. A lot of work is going towards that, but there's a lot of room for opportunity for, as we know, HSIs and advising research, right? And
Mm-hmm.
there's a need, right? There's even a need for advising Latinos, right? Which my work with Nikata, what's a project we're doing now? What does the literature say about advising Latino students? We are gathering that data now so we can publish on that because surprise, there's not much in the nation's leading advising journal, right? And they know this
Mm.
because I've told them this, right?
Yes.
There's got to be a lot of people, and it's described as a characteristic of the population, but not the study. To your point, never the unit of analysis, right? And so
Never.
there's a need, right? And so conceptualization, anti-racism, those things help elevate those conversations. And when one institution does it, dominoes come, right? The dominoes
Mm-hmm.
start falling. We see institutions who lead, right? And HSIs are really great at leading when they choose to lead, right? They're okay
Mm-hmm.
with being different. They're okay with, saying that's not going to work for our students. We're going to do our own thing, right? Fantastic, right? Get that advising conversation going on your campus, right? That
Mm-hmm.
is
Right. By the way, anyone that's listening and is trying to take notes like very fast, like, okay, writing all this down, most of these things are linked in the show notes. So go ahead and click on the show notes. Cause like I said, a lot of your work is open access, right? Like you can click it and you'll get there. So I love that,
yeah,
that people can access some of this because you're offering really good tips that I think a lot of our HSI practitioners that are listening can definitely take into their work immediately, right? So
thank you.
thank you for that. And yeah, when you have the updated or the newly published, when it comes out, I can add it to the show notes too. So just let me know
Cool.
because I'm happy to share. I just like to share resources, right? And I think everyone that
Yeah.
listens knows that. Like anything to make us better HSIs, I'm on board, right? Like I am all for
Cool.
it. So
Okay. Okay.
so
I'll
we
send it your way.
Okay, awesome. We talked about potentially thinking about an interaction of the Servingness framework and your humanistic advising model, but you did publish an article called Advising Latino Students at Hispanic Serving Institutions, a strategy rooted in servingness and intentionality. So
Mhm.
tell us about that, because that was guided by the Servingness framework. So I'd love to hear about it,
Yeah.
of course.
I think it was getting to what we talked about a little bit. It was like saying, there's this notion that we know servingness is part of advising, right? That is for
Mm-hmm.
me less of a thing to be proven, just feels like we're facts to me. Because I think about Servingness as an organizational theory. For me, like coming from that
Yes.
background, it's like, yeah, org theory, right? So I'm
Yes.
like,
I'm glad you
yes,
got that.
yeah.
Not everybody
So
gets
I'm
that.
like, so I frame it in that article as it's an organizational theory, right? And with that organizational
Yes.
theory, you're right. I said you got to talk about how you are being reactive, responsive, and proactive, right? In meaningful
Mhm.
ways. I think what I speak to without saying it is there's this concept of culturally relevant advising, which I
Mhm.
get. But I think what we're seeing with these components in this article of serving this as intentionality is the examples of diving into sense of belonging, familial environments, and student growth and development in the advising context is you're actually creating more of a culturally congruent advising model,
Mhm.
right? Less
Yeah.
of a culturally relevant one, right? And
Yes.
so because they're working towards a culturally congruent model, something to be, again, another paper forthcoming, but like to sit there and say, hey, humanistic advising is about creating cultural congruency, right? And this isn't whether you're Latino, African American, Native American, Asian American, white, whatever. It's about meeting you as you are, and cultural context is there, DEI or not, right?
Mhm.
And so I think as you start seeing what's in that article, it's saying, hey, they're creating these cultural context components that connect to that serving this framework, right? That we see, right?
Mhm.
Uh, Thinking more strategically about how you're designing these experiences as a result of that serving this framework and sort of those interconnectivities that exist between serving this and advising as a practice, right? And elevating some of that work. So yeah, that's sort of how
Yes.
it connected for me. Yeah.
Okay, love it. Always love to hear anything servingness related, of course. But yeah, the reality is all this whole conversation has been right
Yeah.
around this idea of servingness, and you are being so intentional, right, about thinking about the context that this is happening in. Shout out to David Ortiz for helping you to get to that lens. I love it. I love the intentionality
Thank
of
you.
thinking about the context, right? The context
Yeah.
matters so much. So, speaking of the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions, tell us about the center and about your role as a visiting scholar. You're actually the first person I've had from the center, despite the fact that I've been very engaged with the center in the
Yeah.
past. So, happy to have you here. So, tell us a little bit about it so people know.
Well, I'm always happy to be the first. So thank you. Excited
Yes.
about that. Let's see. So I've been with the Rutgers Center for about almost 5 years as a visiting scholar. I love it. It's project-based work, so they help with research in this role. The proposals, get an opportunity to study what I like to study. It's remote work, so that's really exciting. I've been with them for the past, like I said, 5 years. Shout out to Dr. Gassman for like everything she's done to support my research and help back it up and elevate my voice in this work. Right. Um, Super grateful. I've done 3 reports. Again, the third one will come out hopefully in the next month or so. A webinar on the report that I did in September, which was on HSIs and advising. I absolutely loved it. I love the focus on MSIs. I love the focus. I think I was one of the first ones to talk about HSIs as a visiting scholar. I think most of the work, and again, because of Dr. Gassman's background in HBCUs, I think there was a large interest in HBCUs with visiting scholars. So I think I was one of the first to go in and be like, I'm interested in HSIs, right? But
Yes.
my first study was about MSIs because there really wasn't anything, and there still isn't much about MSIs in advising, right?
Mm.
I think just again, to David's credit, and to my dissertation work, HSIs were a natural segue, right? So studying that space is both personal and professional for me, right? And so ways of serving my community really stood out with that research. So I was like, I want to dive deeper into this. So I got to feel a lay of the land with that first MSI report, and then now I'm really focusing and honing in on the HSIs. So excited about that. Yeah.
Okay.
I Go ahead. I think if there's people that are interested in engaging, we got a couple of programs that I think would be really fascinating. One of them is the Elevate program. That's for early career faculty. So
Mhm.
for those that are working at an MSI, looking to get into the faculty space, it's a training, if you will, an experience, a cohorted experience that works you through how to navigate those tenure processes, right? How to navigate academia, right? Building your research agenda, right? How you go about publishing, like all of those are things mentorship that come into play about, supporting early career faculty in their experiences. And I think the other component that I think I would encourage everybody to consider too is for those that are MSI. I think it's aspiring leaders at MSIs.
Mm-hmm.
That one speaks to future presidents, right? And
Mm.
they go through a training as well, a very intense training about presidential leadership and what that looks like, and how to prepare you for those conversations and those experiences when you get to that level in your career, right? So I would say those are two really wonderful opportunities for those that are looking to engage in the work for themselves in their career. And then, heck, if you want to be a visiting scholar, check out the information on the website. There's wonderful opportunities that exist there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Gassman is always looking for, I don't want to speak for her, but she's always looking for, I would hope, good talent, right? To join the team, right? So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for giving
Yeah.
us that background on some of the programs. Because yeah, I think people
Yeah.
listening could definitely access some of the programs. Some people are aware of the center, but not everybody. But I don't know that people
Yeah.
know they do so many programmatic things. A lot of professional development, right? A lot of support for educators at MSIs, both faculty and leaders at MSI. So definitely want to give you a little bit of time to talk about that. Now,
Thanks.
yeah, for sure. Another organization you have worked for that many of our listeners know about is Excellencia in Education, and you had multiple roles in Excellencia. So tell us a little bit about your time there and what you learned about servingness in the policy intermediary space.
Yeah. I would say my time with Excencia was, I think it was because I had just finished my doctoral degree. It felt more like a postdoc. It wasn't formally a postdoc. But I
Mm,
think because of learning the context and learning at that level, at that national level with that national lens, it felt like it was definitely a new space because I had been solely in the institutional space for, at that point, a little over a decade, right? So now
mhm,
transitioning to that space was a wonderful growth opportunity. In that space, I learned my work was really on the post completion work and workforce information, right? Workforce data. That's really where I focused on, was studying Latinos post completion, right? Had a wonderful opportunity there to learn from HSIs to see how they were
mm,
thinking about post completion. How are they measuring post completion for their
mm.
students? You know,
Yeah.
and what do those metrics look like? What does that conversation begin with? Like, what are you doing, right? And exploring those efforts, and then from that identifying some strategies and some practices that HSIs were doing. I think I had 7 HSIs in the study that I looked at that we published about in the Beyond Completion brief. Through that, we got to see some wonderful things that institutions are doing, right? How they're organizing themselves to have those conversations, identify the development of surveys and what they're looking to track as a result. What do they consider post completion success, right? They've had already defined or assumed success is graduation or completion, right? What does completion look like? The certificate that they earned, the badge that they earned, the credential,
Mhm,
what did that look like, right? Or was it the growth outcome? What were you looking
mm.
for in that space? To post completion, well, sometimes job, salary, like the list goes on. There's civic engagement. What are you looking at? And so that really got some wonderful conversation going for those campuses to start thinking about, well, how are we looking at this? Speaking to the value of the return on investment, right? And getting hopefully a little more ahead for their campus for that national dialogue that's been going on for quite some
Yeah.
time, right? So that was really exciting, I think. Um, yeah, I liked it. I did a lot of research. Did a lot of writing, a lot of focus groups, a lot of interviews. Just again, it felt to me more postdoc. But in
Mhm.
that space, learned quite a bit about what it is to be heading up and learning from that entire group there, right? What it means
Yeah.
to intentionally serve, to borrow their language, to intentionally serve your Latino population, right? Yeah, and fulfill that mission of advancing Latino student success in higher ed and the workforce. So yeah,
Okay. Oh, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I hadn't
yeah,
thought much about their work in that area. All the different post completion outcomes, which is important, right? Like we need to be thinking about that. Obviously, a very policy driven sort of
yeah,
work as well, right? Like that is
yeah.
much more policy relevant. What are the things that nationally we care about? And that, yeah, I think that definitely speaks to that. So, okay, awesome. Well,
Yeah.
thanks for sharing some of that.
You're welcome.
So, final question before we get out of the podcast is always the same question. So, everybody always prepares for it. Hopefully, you're ready. How do you
Okay.
respond to the question? ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
Oh. This one I had to think about for a bit, and I think I've said it quite a bit today, but it's HSIs, ¿qué pasa? What are you doing about this developing more conceptual natures of and structures for your advising, right? What's your advising philosophy, right? How are you creating the conceptual nature and connecting that to servingness, right? To again be more intentional to serve your students through advising, right? One of the biggest facts is, what, 63% of Latinos are enrolled in HSIs, right? But that also means that HSIs are responsible for advising 63% of Latinos,
Mm,
right?
yes.
That's a shift, right? You are now
Yes.
responsible for advising, not just enrolling, but advising 62, 63% of the Latino population. What are you doing about it?
Mm.
For me, that's a pretty direct question, right? How intentional are you going to be in meeting the needs of your students through your advising structures, through your advisors themselves? What are you doing to train them, right? To make sure that they're ready so that when those 62, 63, 64% of Latinos hit your campus, you're ready for them. Yeah.
Love it. That's what's up, HSIs. Think about it. Thank you for joining me today on Que Pasa HSIs.